Welcome to the Expert Series, where we explore the issues shaping Canadian national security and defense. I'm Gabriella Picton, Research Assistant for the CDA Institute. The 2025 Munich Security Conference marked a major turning point away from the U.S.-led international system. By bringing together Laura Thornton, Dr. Balkan Devlen, and Dr. Leonard Schütte, three experts in transatlantic democracy and security with experience across Europe, Eurasia, and North America, we'll discuss the implications of these changes for Europe's defense posture and relations with allies like Canada. This is the Expert Series. Now we'll speak to Laura Thornton, Senior Director of the McCain Institute in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode of the Expert Series podcast program. We're thrilled to have you on to discuss the state of transatlantic democracy and security cooperation, truly vital conversation in light of recent shifts in international security, alliances, and dynamics since the 2025 Munich Security Conference. To start, I'd like to look all the way to the end of the alliance's borders and to allies that have both recently and in years past been attempting to join. So, since the 2008 war into the present day, Georgia has historically served as a geopolitical warning sign for the West. How should NATO allies interpret recent developments that are occurring in Georgia?
Yes, that's a great question. I think what we, and I don't mean just NATO, but I mean the international community in general, really missed early warning signs in Georgia. So I was, several of us who were working on the ground at Tbilisi and working on democracy programming could see very early on, like in 2017, 2016 even, that there were a couple warning signs about the country's stability with regard to governance and democracy. And this, of course, has ripple effects to the security architecture of the country and the region. And I think it was partly a little bit of a stubbornness on our part. We wanted to believe that Georgia was this little darling in a very difficult region. So I think we had, in some ways, some blind spots. And I think what we can take away from that is not to let that happen elsewhere. That we shouldn't be waiting for a 5-alarm fire to wake up and be like, oh man, things are not great in Georgia, when rather than acting a little bit earlier when we could see warning signs. And what I mean by that is, some of the building blocks of a stable, good governance structure for a country were not there. For example, the country never really embarked on a rule of law reform process that had been beleaguering the country, predating the Georgian Dream government in Georgia, but also other things that we've seen in other countries in Europe and in North America too, a rising far-right illiberalism that was percolating back in 2016 with attacks on women, with attacks on LGBTQ. And these are often, and I'm a democracy geek, so I've seen this around the world, these are early warning signs for other things. So it starts with LGBTQ community and gender issues, but it quickly moves to independent media, it quickly moves to restrictions on civil society. It quickly moves to in other directions that weaken the country with regard to a democratic building block for NATO. The other thing I think NATO didn't quite understand is to take sort of top line polling figures as orthodoxy. So yes, the Georgian people, and I did those polls. I led the National Democratic Institute, and we did all the political polling there. And yes, if you looked at those top lines, Georgians really approved of NATO. And I think there was too much of a washing our hands like everything's fine. But if they had really spent time and looked at more of our research and more of our data, they would have understood that was a little bit fragile. That if you presented Georgia with security guarantees, they were going to say yes. But if you also presented them with so for example, 80% of Georgians approved of joining the EU, but like a lot of them also approved of joining the Eurasian Customs Union. It was like, we just want to belong to things, right? And also, if we measured a lot of disinformation around NATO, And while Georgians could say, yes, I believe that Georgia should join NATO, they simultaneously believed myths about NATO. For example, a quarter of Georgians believing NATO hurt the Orthodox Church. Many people believing, like 40% believing that NATO would hurt Georgian traditional values. So both things can be true at the same time. And I think what NATO allies, but also more broadly European Union and more broadly the international community was missing was some of these threats that were lurking in Georgia and also in the public's perception. So in terms of a warning sign, I think looking at other countries, we should be more mindful to act earlier, that we should do a better job at preempting some of the threats to democracy before they get out of control. We should understand that these countries have domino effects. So what's happening in Georgia today is going to affect Armenia very deeply. It's affecting Azerbaijan, which was Georgia was a safe space for democratic activists from Azerbaijan. And understand Russia's tactics. So they use countries as testing grounds, and they've had amazing success in Georgia. So they're going to use that playbook elsewhere, and they are in the Balkans, they're using it in Eastern Europe, they're using it in other countries. So I guess what I would end on is just having a little bit more foresight.
You've touched a great deal on ways that Russia uses countries in Eastern Europe and Eurasia as sort of testing grounds for their positions that they take towards others. I'm wondering if you can elaborate now a bit on what this signals about Russia's security posture towards the NATO alliance, particularly as the war in Ukraine seems to be being forced to close, and we could see these ripple effects potentially in Ukraine or elsewhere throughout the region.
Well, I think the war in Ukraine has had ripple effects on Georgia and the region. I think what happened, and unfortunately it seems that the Georgian Dream regime read the tea leaves correctly, which was that they saw Russia's invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and they took a bet that Russia would win. And then they postured themselves accordingly. I mean, there were other reasons for the Georgian Dream regime to have closer ties to Russia, mostly because they don't want to be a democracy and they want to stay in power. And international Western community would be bugging them about that. So, that's one reason to get close to Russia. But another reason was they were thinking that the allies would not stay strong. And so the war in Ukraine was a pivot point for the Georgian Dream regime because they were betting on the fact that Russia would be winning. The other thing that they could use from the war in Ukraine was that they could tap into the fear of the general public, and they did that very effectively. Fear is a powerful political tool, and Georgia's an occupied country, and people are very passionate about the occupied territories, for example, in Georgia. And so Georgian Dream very easily can manipulate, look what happened, it's going to happen here if we don't play nice. And so I think, and because we are, unfortunately, particularly the United States, seems to be conceding to Russia and Ukraine, conceding to Russia about the war in Ukraine and forced into some sort of negotiated settlement, I think, we've seen weakness in the alliance, and I think that our adversaries are winning. So if you asked me, what should the alliance take away from this is that, we're losing. And I think that we failed to demonstrate security guarantees. I think we've failed to defend countries on the eastern frontier. And this is a signal to Russia that, hey, we can do more. If we get away with it in Ukraine, not that there weren't great losses for Russia, but if they are able to get all the concessions that they asked for, no NATO membership for Ukraine, all the territories that they've taken, lifting of sanctions, rejoining the G8, this is then the message is loud and clear. that we aren't going to defend democracies. And then they can say, oh, yay. And Georgia, Moldova are next. And then it's looking more broadly at autocrats Inc. The message that we've sent to China, the message we've sent to other adversaries. So I really, I mean, and not to be really gloomy, but I think, you know, I think this and not to mean that there isn't time to reverse course. I mean, we're not there yet. There is time. But I think that the message has been sent that we've lost the battle here if we really concede Ukraine to Russia and its ripple effects for other countries in the region.
Looking now to some of the loudest indicators of this message that we're sending to Russia and other autocrats that are involving themselves across the region, what do you anticipate that the impact of USAID funding cuts will be in Ukraine and beyond? And how can countries in Eastern Europe and Eurasia best prepare?
I guess this is going to be a really gloomy interview because it's catastrophic. It's catastrophic. And I worked, almost every organization I've worked for has received USAID funding. All the work I was doing in democracy building was funded by the United States Agency for International Development. And granted, okay, I was an international organization. Maybe the world wouldn't collapse. You know, it's not going to collapse without international organizations per se. But the amount of support to domestic civil society groups that were provided through USAID, also provided for the National Endowment for Democracy, which has also been suspended, even though that isn't part of USAID, and it's a congressional allocation. So there's serious concerns about the legality of cutting that off in Treasury. Civil society, meaning all these democracy activists, all the watchdogs, the people that are the Transparency International outfits, the election observers that work in these countries that are holding government to account, let alone independent media. For example, Georgia. Who's reporting on the Georgian protests? Who do we rely on for information funded by USAID? Who's representing the prisoners that have been detained, the protesters who've been illegally tortured and then arrested for protesting? Who are their lawyers? They're funded by USAID. You know, so you look at the entire democratic, you know, unfortunately, a lot of the countries that we provide foreign aid to don't have a domestic, you know, charitable enterprise that's going to support democracy activists. It's just the way it is. I used to live in Asia. I lived in Cambodia. I lived in Thailand. Same there. You know, you can't expect people that are like living under the poverty line to be like, yeah, I'm going to support the local watchdog organization. No, they rely on foreign aid to be able to do the things they do. And without a robust branch of government, which I do view the civil society and independent media as the fourth pillar, without them, then we're going to see a massive backsliding in these countries that we've already seen backsliding. But this is just absolute gift to autocrats. I mean, the Kremlin must be just jumping up and down and popping champagne because, and the Georgian Dream government, delighted. And you can see they're tweeting all about it. They're like, yay, see, we were right. They're, you know, they're staging a coup. They're part of the global war party, et cetera, et cetera. So it's catastrophic. Now, what can we do about it? I really don't have great ideas other than a very simplistic one, which is, you know, the European Union needs to help. And they need to step in, and other rich countries need to step in, and they're never going to make up for the entire gap that's going to be left by USAID, but they got to try. And this is also coming at a really bad time for because another organization that provided amazing support to civil society on the ground, really grassroots efforts, was the Soros Foundation. And they've also gone through a restructuring that they're not giving as many grants to these small organizations that are fighting for democracy, that are fighting for equal rights and supporting independent media and watchdog efforts. Also was already being defunded. Now you have USAID gone. Now you have the NED gone. It's gonna have serious consequences. So I hope that other international donor organizations can step in and fill the gap, because we can't expect, crowdsourcing among the Georgian public to make up for the millions of dollars that have been supplied by USAID. And in the meantime, advocacy within the United States, legal action within the United States to try to get that money reinstated.
To move to tie this, as you said, absolutely catastrophic and freeze to U.S. foreign aid funding to more of the international security element of this issue, how do you anticipate that this will affect NATO's deterrent strategy across Eastern Europe and Eurasia and beyond?
NATO piggybacks on all this other work. They I don't mean to use a derogative term, but they're freeloaders on the infrastructure that foreign aid provides. So NATO can't move forward in a country without all those building blocks that are supported through foreign aid. So whether we're talking about good governance reforms to get them up to standard to join NATO or to comply with the requirements of NATO, whether we're talking about rule of law, whether we're talking about the bureaucracy and civil service, whether we're talking about defense procurement, all of these things that help contribute to the security, building blocks to enable a country to be a reliable member of NATO, all of those things have depended on foreign aid. And also the absolute link, as we see very clearly, between democracy and security. I mean, I love democracy. You have me at democracy. Like, I'm on board. I want to support democracy around the world. But it's not just that. Democracy is a security issue. Russia invaded Ukraine because it's a democracy. If it wasn't a democracy, if it was Lukashenko, they never would have invaded because they don't need to. And that's the strategy they're using in Georgia. I don't need to invade Georgia yet because I'm just going to co-opt and manipulate this anti-democratic regime. And they're going to be a loyal patron and they're going to be a vassal state of Russia. And then I don't need to really invade them with kinetic warfare. So all the things to prevent that, to ensure that the country itself is strong and resilient, is supported by foreign aid. So I think, we need to be better at, first of all, understanding that democracy is a security issue. Democracy is a tech issue. Democracy is a trade issue. All of these things are affected. If we don't have, robust markets and a rule of law, how do we have effective business and trade and engagement with countries? If we don't have healthcare and supporting programs to stop infectious diseases, it's going to come to us. If we don't have robust economies that provide for the people, we're going to have increased migration. So we act as if these things are happening over there. They're not. It's gonna affect all of us, but it also affects our overall security, our health security, our economic security, our tech security. Emerging technologies that autocrats use in these countries will come back to bite us. And our security architecture, if we don't have strong, resilient countries and democracies, we will, be faced with more conflict and more challenges that will end up on our doorstep. And eventually, a NATO country will be affected and we will have to, implement Article 5 and we'll have all these ripple effects. So I think that, NATO really relied on foreign aid because of all those building blocks I just described, which is why it's really important that the NATO member countries need to step up and invest. If the United States is checked out right now, well, then the other members are going to have to take on a bigger load, not just in percentage of defense support, not just in creating alternative European security arrangements, but in terms of democratic support and foreign aid.
We're reaching the end of our questions for today, so I'd like to circle back to the core of these changes that are driving this issue. How do you project that America's foreign policy posture is evolving, and ultimately, how would you say that this is affecting relations with allies, both those in NATO and neighboring states?
Well, I think that to be blunt, I think we've seen a 180 on our foreign policy. The United States foreign policy under the Trump administration has done a radical 180. All the values that values and interests that we used to approach our foreign policy posture has radically changed. So whether we're talking about foreign aid or we're talking about who are our allies, who do we defend, who do we stand up for, with particularly, I think, obviously, we're very focused on the foreign aid thing, which we've already discussed, and how, from the Trump administration's point of view, in my view, it's very short-sighted, as I just described, because there's this isolationism that they think, oh, foreign aid, it doesn't affect us. I've already explained that, of course it does. So it's very short-sighted. But it speaks to a deeper transactional nature of the Trump, and particularly President Trump, of the administration. What am I getting out of this? I'm not going to just give things for free. I want something in return. And by I want, it almost certainly means the president himself. What's he getting in return? And then, of course, so that's the foreign aid part. But then, of course, we're seeing this really play out with the full-scale invasion and the fact that the United States is not including Ukraine in its negotiations with Russia, or it had negotiations with Russia and Saudi Arabia without Ukraine. It seemed to have given Putin every single thing he wanted, every single concession he wanted, as I discussed earlier, from, saying Ukraine will never be a member of NATO. You can have all the land because you fought really hard for it. You can join the G8. We're going to lift sanctions, everything, and not a single concession from Russia. So they get everything they want. And so it's no wonder that our allies are like, whose side are you on? But it also leads to an important question. What are we getting in return? And we don't know because it's not transparent. So I have no idea it's unlikely that Trump would have offered Putin everything that he wanted without something in return. We don't know what that something is, because it's, at the expense of our relationships with our allies. It's at the expense of the independent sovereign democracy Ukraine. It's at the expense of all these things. So what are we getting? And so I think our allies have every right to be very concerned about what's happening. And then that's Ukraine. And then, of course, our very combative relationship with regard to implementing these tariff regimes. And, I am actually, you could get me on board with selective strategic tariffs against China. I think that particularly in areas that touch upon our national security, like in technology and some other things, I actually am very supportive. Why are we attacking Mexico and Canada? These are our friends, but it's also foolhardy because it's going to hurt Americans. So our whole foreign posture seems to have completely flipped the script. Who are our friends and who are our foes? And even down to the language that the Trump administration uses, or Trump himself uses, I've never heard him criticize our adversaries, but I hear him criticize our allies all the time. So I do think we're in uncharted territory. I think that we're going to have this, completely new posture towards the world, which is it's not isolationism as people feared and guessed that he would be an isolationist, because it's not. It's very combative and plus expansionist. He's talking about making Canada the 51st state. He's talking about taking Greenland. He's talking about seizing Panama. And he's talking about taking over Gaza. So all of these things are just very counter to, I would call, very bipartisan understanding of how we conduct foreign affairs. It's a complete departure that we haven't seen before. And so my only hope is that we have other branches of government that actually step up and do their jobs. I would like to see Congress, which is an equal branch. It is supposed to be a check on the administration. I would love to see them use that. But for now, I do agree with our European friends that they need to start hustling on their own. They need to start making alternative arrangements. They need to start thinking about their own security. They need to start protecting their own economies and understand that maybe the United States will be out of commission for a while as a friend and ally. I hope that's not forever. And my only other plea would be an understanding from our European allies that this doesn't represent all of the United States, and that there are still partnerships to be had, maybe at a state level, certainly with American civil society. So hopefully all the transatlantic relations don't have to be completely severed, because there's a lot. It's the same way that the United States didn't sever relationships with democratic allies that were struggling with authoritarian regimes elsewhere. We would hope the same would be true for the United States.
Thank you very much for your time today. We're incredibly grateful for your perspective on particularly the last point, that the United States is, like we, so many others, struggle with authoritarian regimes. We should get the same grace now and build alliances with smaller states or civil society. So I know our listeners will benefit particularly from that, and will benefit as Canadians in knowing that there is still some hope to be had for the relationship in the future. Now we'll speak to Dr. Balkan Devlen, Director of the Transatlantic Program and Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode of the Expert Series podcast program. We're really thrilled to have you on to discuss the changing state of international security dynamics and what they mean for the current key global players. If it's all right with you, I'd love to jump right into the questions and get started.
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. So, based upon the discussions at the recent 2025 Munich Security Conference, are we seeing any indicators of a move towards a more multipolar world? And in your opinion, what were the key indicators as to where global power is shifting? If you could talk a bit about the conference and dynamics and discussions there.
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks for having me. I was not in the conference, so I'm sure some of your other participants will have a better understanding of what's going on the ground. But what the news, and as well as the interviews and coming out of it, as well as talking with some of my friends and colleagues who were there, I think there are a couple of ways to conceptualize what's going on. Number one, and this is not necessarily very unique way of framing this particular topic, but it seems to me the reaction, particularly from our European allies, coming from Munich Security Conference, can be likened to the 7 stages of grief when it comes to the future of the U.S.-led liberal international order. So it was a mixture of dismay, shock, anger, and at some level also, I would say, denial of where the things are going. But I think we are moving forward regardless, and that was a very understandable reaction, because we, both here in Canada, but also our European allies, have been very used to, in the past 30 years or so, 35 years, of a unipolar moment that seems to be expanding indefinitely. And this year's Munich conference was perhaps the most clear indication that going forward, that is not going to be the case. Now, whether the evolving international structure means we're moving towards a genuinely multipolar world, or are we moving towards a different kind of, a new bipolarity in a way, not necessarily the same way we think with the Cold War, but So on the margins, it might be different alignments and more fluid alignments. But are we moving towards a more bifurcation of the international system that will eventually settle down into two blocks where China is leading one with other other countries such as Russia, Iran, and others around China, and another one with the United States leading, but the relationship between U.S. and its other partners taking a different shape than it is during the unipolar moment? Or are we really going to see a truly sort of a multipolar moment in where you have multiple centers of power that are actually competing with each other in a more clear way? I'm not convinced that we are moving towards a truly multipolar moment. And not to get too technical, but I mean, you can have a tripolar structure, or you can have a multipolar structure if you have more than three power centers. But the central of it, the central notion of polarity, if you think through international relations perspective, is the ability of each pole to be able to shape its environment, as well as engage in its own economic and security arrangements independent of the other major poles, and the fact that none of them can individually take on the other poles, right? So that's sort of the notion of a multipolarity. I'm not sure we will be moving towards there. To me, it looks like we're moving towards much more of a bifurcated system. However, the relationship within each bloc will be structured differently. And on the Western Bloc, if you think more broadly, that will be more or less U.S.-led, given the disparities between economic and military power, in which Canada and Europe and are in the Pacific, some of our Indo-Pacific allies will belong to. The relationship between the leading member of that bloc and the other members will not necessarily look like the one we had in the unipolar moment after the collapse of the Soviet Union in early 1990s. So I would be careful in terms of portraying this as a multipolar moment, in the sense of a truly multipolar structure. It is perhaps a more flexible, more fluid moment, but it will probably settle down in a bifurcated, broadly bifurcated system, in which we have two major powers shaping their own regional as well as their sort of associated alliance systems, and understanding that, I think, will be critical both for Canada and for Europe, and we should not be under any illusions to assume that there is a viable sort of a third or fourth pole that either Europe or Canada can be part of.
You've described a number of different potential pathways for international power structures to evolve, including stressing the notion of this potential for a bifurcated system to emerge. I'm wondering if you can elaborate a bit further on what this means specifically, or could mean for Ukraine, and elaborate a little bit further as well what the implications will be for European security in both the short and the long term.
No, couple things. I think the future is not necessarily written yet. I know there is a lot of concern and worry, and both in Europe, in Ukraine, and in Canada about the direction that the United States is taking. I think it's important to recognize at this stage that the U.S. is moving towards a more traditional great power role, right? In which the previous hegemon in the unipolar moment that provided the global public goods, including the maintenance of an open trade system, safety and security of passage in high seas, forward deployments in around the world to ensure that regional conflicts don't turn into wars, and those wars don't turn into global conflicts, etc. That's sort of a hegemonic role in which United States bear the cost of carrying the public good, which benefited the U.S. significantly as well, is changing. U.S. is moving towards a much more traditional balance of power understanding when it comes to dealing with other great powers, and therefore positioning itself less as a global hegemon of a unipolar international system, but more as a great power that is getting ready for a long-term confrontation with the other major great power that is China. You might have other regional powers such as Russia and others, and Europe that will find this place in this particular structure. But I think it is sort of important to understand that when we look at from the European side and from about the future of Ukraine, we need to understand where U.S. is positioning itself. And this is not necessarily, I would say, limited to Donald Trump and his administration. He's a particular avatar, and perhaps an extreme avatar of this very transactionalist, very classical great power thinking, spheres of influence thinking. But he's not the only one. I think it also represents a broader shift in American strategic culture and the zeitgeist and thinking about international politics. We don't necessarily need to get into the details of why that is the case and why the Americans don't think it is in their national interest anymore to play that global hegemon and carry the global public goods going forward. But I think this is where we are heading. Now, because we are heading there, I think Europe also needs to sort of think of itself of how to position to protect its interests, right? And I think that would require a couple adjustments. Number one, that it requires overcoming the on the defense and security issues, overcoming the fact that Europe, as it stands, is not a single unit. It has different threat perceptions. The Nordic Baltic countries have a different threat perception and actions compared to that threat perception versus the countries in the south, say Spain, for example, or Italy. And in the Western Europe, it's a different threat perception and ability to do things versus the one in Central and Eastern Europe, right? So this fragmentation as a security actor in Europe also needs to be taken into account. So Europe first needs to sort of figure out, is it in the European in the European interest? And how can you calibrate various national interests within Europe that are diverse when it comes to security and investing in security compared to the price that they're willing to pay to support other European countries? Because if the security is indivisible within Europe, you have to rethink how Europe as an actor can act in defense and security stuff. So I think there's number one, that has to come. The number two is that it is clear that American support, American presence in Europe will not necessarily be completely out, but will be decreased. I think it is very clear that, and this is not again only Trump. This has been Clinton, Obama, George W. Bush, Biden. It has been a coming warning saying that U.S. is not in a position to continue to be the primary guarantor, conventionally speaking, of security in Europe, and Europeans need to step up and take the majority of the burden when it comes to conventional defense and security of the continent. I don't think this means that Americans will pull up stakes and leave, but it will be a backstop as a part of the extended deterrence and American strategic deterrence, as well as theater deployed tactical deterrence will remain an important component through NATO, will remain an important component of defense and security in Europe. But conventionally, they are turning towards Indo-Pacific, and that's where the attention will go, which means Europe needs to not only ramp up its indigenous capabilities when it comes to producing weapons and ammunition and capabilities as strategic enablers, which will continue to remain reliant on the United States, especially on ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, high-end space-based and other capabilities, etc. So there is a dependence that will remain. But the other component part of it is that it is very clear that Europe would need to start getting out of the mindset of it's guns versus butter, and we want to protect the butter, right? The whole social welfare spending and all of the thing, and thus we don't want to spend on the guns. That mindset would need to change, and one of the, I think, reactions, the disbelief and the anger, stages of grief that I mentioned in Europe is the fact that now there is a national security premium that needs to be paid, and there is clear differences within Europe, right? The Nordic, the northeastern flank, I would say, starting from Nordics, the Baltics, and going down to Central and Eastern Europe, Czech Republic, Poland, etc., as well as our Baltic allies and our Nordic allies, recognize this, and they put the money where their mouth is, right? Poland is going to get to 5% of GDP spending. So some European countries understand this much better than others, but it has to come there, and that there is a need to pay the national security premium. That if you don't have the guns, soon you will not have the butter, right? So that will come. Now, what it means, and I know I've gone for a little while on this one, but let me talk on the Ukraine component. I think again the future is yet to be written. A couple of things are clear from my perspective. I don't think there is a sustainable peace on the horizon, primarily because Russia has no intention of altering its policies and ultimate objectives of subjugating Ukraine, erasing its nationhood, and turning into a vassal state. That was and that remains the primary goal of Kremlin, and he believes, and Vladimir Putin believes, that he can outlast the West and European support to Ukraine and Ukraine's ability to defend, resist, and push back, because he believes that the West and Europeans particularly don't have the political will. American policy going forward, I think, would be primarily leaving that responsibility to Europe. All this brouhaha with the middle deal and other things and so forth, to me, it reads a lot more about Trump administration wanting to wash his hands off Ukraine and move, which means Europe needs to step up. It can step up, and it will if it has the political will. It is partly capability issue, but that is being built. The reason why it is being built slower is the unwillingness of the political component. Europe, European Union particularly, but not only that, the UK as well, need to decide what Ukraine means and what Ukraine's security and sovereignty means for their defense, security, and prosperity. And once you identify what it means if Ukraine falls under Russian control, be it either as a vassal state or as a completely neutered gray zone within Europe, what does that mean for going forward for European security? I think it is clear for our Baltic, Central Eastern European and Nordic allies that this is an existential threat to European project, European security, European freedom, and prosperity. I'm not sure that is necessarily being shared with the rest, particularly in Western Europe and other places. So Europe needs to have a very tough conversation and realize what they need to pay up. Europe has the means, 500 million people, trillions of dollars worth of economy, an amazing industrial base that can be ramped up, right, to produce what is necessary to defend, protect, and force Russia to alter their cost calculation. Russia has more resources, yes, but they are not unlimited. And compared to what Europe has, they're little. What they have in abundance is a political will that is willing to see this through. He believes, in other words, Vladimir Putin believes, that he can last longer than the political will in Europe and the West has, right? But it is not indefinite. Can he sustain the same level of cost, human and material cost and economic cost, of continuing his brutal assault on Ukraine for another 18 months, 24 months, 36 months? I'm not sure. 18 months, maybe. 36 months? I don't think so, right? But his calculation, and unfortunately he's right at this stage, is that he can last longer than Europe and the West willing to pay the price. And it is on the money at this stage. I mean, that's, I think Europeans need to also realize that, and Canada in that case, this is just money. We're not paying the ultimate price like Ukrainians do. So I think what this means, this new world order emerging is, for Ukraine and for Ukraine's security, is a bleak picture. It's a bleak picture because I don't think Russia changed its fundamental goals. So there is no overlapping. There might be a temporary ceasefire which they can slowly eat out or restart again the war without any security guarantees. And security guarantees would need to be actual presence, I would say. Otherwise, they're not really credible. And Russians are not willing to accept that anyway. So what we will probably see is a drag out negotiations, a sort of a ceasefire that will be violated within weeks or months, and resumption of the war, which Ukraine can win and push back, but it requires significantly on Europeans' ability to ramp up, to put their money where their mouth is, and actually not only defend Europe and develop those capabilities, but also provide them to Ukraine. Will there be such a political will coming up? I am not particularly sure. So I am a bit on the pessimistic side. But it does, like I said, it does not mean that the future means despair. It is within our ability. It's within Europeans' ability to make sure that the cost calculus in Kremlin changes, that not only Vladimir Putin, but also the Russian political elite recognizes that the cost of human, he may not care about it, but his people will eventually. Human cost, the material cost, the economic cost, the political cost of continuing with its maximalist aims of vassalization of Ukraine is not worth it. Europe and Ukraine together, and with Canada providing, support, can make that happen. Will we have the political will to do so? That remains to be seen, and unfortunately, I am not particularly optimistic about it. So the future, in that sense, look bleak. But it doesn't mean It also doesn't mean that the front will collapse and the Russians will march into Kiev. I don't think Ukrainian people will give up on that. They recognize and understand what it means to live under occupation, and Bucha, Irpin, and all the things that are going on right now in the occupied territories will tell you what that future looks like. So it is existential for them, and they will continue to fight. So it is incumbent upon Europe and Canada to provide the resources to them so that they can continue to do so. But we are at a very precarious moment, both militarily and politically. And so the sooner our European allies particularly recognize that it is time to step up. No more about, are we going to do this through a EU level funding where are we gonna borrow money? Europe spent 800 billion euros in 2022 for energy subsidies because of because Russia's war in Ukraine and the gas prices jumping up, etc., etc. 800 billion euros, right? If there's a will, there's a way. It is about, and that would have to start with what Ukraine means, Ukraine's security, sovereignty, and independence means for Europe, and then what that implies in terms of what Europe needs to do, because Americans are no longer bringing the cavalry. And I think going forward, that we need to sort of understand that given this emerging structure, the best case scenario is different Western allies, Canada focusing on its partnership in the north with Nordic Baltic countries, Europe taking care of its own continent and perhaps the MENA region and the Mediterranean, and coordinating with the US as we face Russia and China and that emerging axis that needs to step up. The holiday from history is over, and we all need to pay the national security premium, because if we don't, and this is doubly true for Europeans, if you don't want to pay pennies today, we will pay hundreds of dollars in the future. And without having that conversation, having a high-level conversation of what does this mean for Europe, and if it is existential and if it is key for European security and freedom and democracy, which I believe it is, then are we putting commensurate resources and effort into it? Without having that, it will only be empty promises and more meetings and communiques and empty slogans of we're going to stand with Ukraine as long as possible, but we're not going to increase our tax base, or we're not going to cut off this particular spending. So Europe needs to, in that sense, decide how important this is and how to move forward with that. And if it decides to take it, I think Ukraine can win this, can win a peace that is just and that preserves an independent, strong Ukraine, because the result was that it imposed costs on Russia that are unacceptable to Russia, and therefore they change tack. Until and unless Ukraine and the West impose sufficient costs on Ukraine, on Russia for its invasion in Ukraine, Russians have no incentive to stop. I'm not seeing, unfortunately, at this stage that we are there.
In this context that you've described, how do you see the role of Canada as a middle power evolving within NATO? And are there any particular regions within the alliance Canada should seek to build closer defense and security ties with?
I think going forward within this broader, change in the international system, I think there are two places where Canada, from a security perspective, security military perspective, can make a difference within the Transatlantic Alliance. Number one is, of course, our north, the Arctic. Arctic, Canadian Arctic, is not NATO's northwestern flank, so it is part of defending that from Russian and increasingly Chinese incursions, etc. is essential, not only for the alliance, but of course also for the national defense here in Canada. So it's very hard to sort of disentangle the Arctic and the component from the continental defense here in Canada. So it is going to be number one. But which also means that the Canadian involvement going forward would need to tie it back to the defense of Arctic and approaches to North America, which means I would say that the real potential when we think about strategic partnerships where Canada can have the most influence, impact, and value added to its allies in this changing world would be what I would call the Nordic-Baltic corridor, or and the North Atlantic, right? So the contribution that Canada has, we already have a forward presence in Latvia, which I would argue is forward defense of Canada in the Baltics. One needs to understand and recognize that Arctic-Baltic connection, the way both the Russians think about it as a single theater, but also because of the countries that are involved, are intimately linked, right? So major Arctic powers are also major Baltic powers. Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Germany, particularly with regards to their increasing interest in the Arctic and the North Atlantic. I think this, to me, is very clear that the group of countries that Canada, the group of NATO allies that Canada needs to work with very closely and and increase both collaboration, interoperability, etc., is that Nordic Baltic line, which includes not only countries such as Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Norway, or the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, but also countries like Germany and Poland and UK. Germany and Poland, of course, being having Baltic presence and providing a connection to the rest of the alliance, but also UK with regards to the North Atlantic. Again, the memorandum of understanding signed between Canada, Norway, and Germany when it comes to North Atlantic maritime security signs to that. So I think in this place where Canada needs to prioritize its defense of the continent and defense of the Arctic, and therefore the defense of NATO's northwestern flank, Canada also needs to then pay attention and be present and collaborate with the allies on the northeastern flank, which means Arctic, Nordic, Baltic connections. And I would argue that going forward, as we increase our role within the alliance, those countries, Germany, Poland, Denmark, Finland, Latvia, those countries are the ones that we need to be increasingly working together because of the connection of the two theaters, both the northwestern and the northeastern. We're facing the same challenge. Russia, it is primarily a naval and Air Force challenge. We can share a lot. We can learn a lot. We can work together a lot. And in this reorganized transatlantic bargain, that is the value that we can bring to the alliance in terms of defending against Russia-China bloc, rather than trying to do everything. I think we need to be very careful here. We don't want to spread too thin. We have limited capabilities. We really need to ramp them up. Where do we focus? We focus them on Arctic, Nordic, Baltic corridor and work with those partners to enable the defense of the alliance and defense of the homeland here at home.
We're coming to the end of our questions for today, but before we proceed with wrapping up, I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about the implications of current global power shifts for Canada's foreign policy and security interests beyond Europe. I know we just talked a bit about the Nordic-Baltic corridor and that being where Canada should concentrate most of its interest. So I'm interested if you see any areas or priorities beyond Europe that Canada can also contribute to as well.
Yes. So as I said, I think the primary top two focus will be, from a defense and security perspective, will be the Arctic and Nordic Baltic corridor. But putting those aside, I think there is an opportunity for Canada to engage with a selected partners in Indo-Pacific, particularly the Northeast Asia, countries like Japan, countries like South Korea, Taiwan, in which Canada could play an important role. Well, whether Canada can actually have the resources to do a military presence there that will meaningfully increase the security, that's debatable. I don't think we will have the Navy or the other capabilities to be able to do so. But what Canada can do, particularly when it comes to our Northeast Asian allies, as well as countries like Australia, but particularly with Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, is we can leverage our natural resources, LNG, our food, agriculture exports. Those are key to the national survival and the economic prosperity of countries such as Japan and South Korea, which are heavily dependent on imported energy and imported foodstuff. Canada can and should be a major guarantor and a supplier of those resources. LNG is of course number one, but also other things including nuclear power, agricultural goods. Canada is and can very well be an energy and an agricultural superpower, right? Food and fuel. Our allies, we may not necessarily have the Navy to be able to send to the Indo-Pacific there if there is a war, but we do have the resources to keep those countries supplied, keep them energy safe, energy secure, food secure, and I think building those ties, having in that sense a more trade and economy-oriented foreign policy outlook towards the Indo-Pacific, working with those key democratic allies in the region, and how we can address and help their societal, economic, energy resilience through our resources is going to be key, which means that, of course, we need to do our homework at home and get those resources out. We will be able to export them. We will be able to get them to the tidewater so that we can actually send them out, right? Particularly in the case of energy. But I think in comparison to the Arctic and Europe, where you can actually focus on the intelligence, the space capabilities, cyber capabilities, naval, air, etc., and the military dimension of it, I would see a more a trade, economy, energy, resource-oriented, centered foreign policy when it comes in the Pacific, because that's the value added that we can bring in, not the 3 ships that we can send if there is a conflict in the region, but ensuring that our allies have reliable, secure supply of critical minerals, of energy, of foodstuff, that they can rely on Canada to do so, which is key in terms of improving their security, right? So we need to think about what we can bring to the table, and in the case of in the Pacific and particularly Northeast Asia, I think that's what we can do. And to be frank and to be blunt, the rest of the world would need to be the 4th, 5th, 6th priority if it comes to it. We can't be everywhere. We don't need to be everywhere. And given the incoming global structuring, ordering, I don't think we need to spend much resources or time or can make meaningful differences, to be frank, in other parts of the world. So to me, the 3 top areas are very clear. It's continental defense in terms of North America and the Arctic, Nordic-Baltic connections and approaches, which is key with the North Atlantic, as well as bringing in useful things for our allies in the Pacific, primarily energy, foodstuff, and critical minerals. If we can do that, if we can actually execute on these 3 things, I think that would be amazing. And hopefully we will. But I think all these 3 are actually a lot of things to do. It requires a lot of state capacity, resources, and a strategic thinking that Canada needs to put and prioritize. If you are everything to everybody, you are not nobody to anybody. Right, so you have to prioritize. We have to focus. We have to engage in selective strategic partnerships in this coming world, because we would need to do more. Americans are going to do less everywhere, and we need to do more. We have limited resources. What is the best way to do that while advancing Canada's national interest? So we have to start with that idea. What is Canada's national interest? How can we advance and defend it? And to me, it's those 3 areas that we need to spend our resources and time and energy.
Well, we've reached the end of our questions for today, and I know our listeners will have already benefited greatly from your perspective on how Canada can best situate itself in this changing global order. Now we'll speak to Dr. Leonard Schütte, Senior Researcher at the Munich Security Conference. Thank you for joining us for today's episode of the Expert Series podcast program. As tensions in U.S.-Ukraine relations have escalated dramatically in the past few weeks, we're thrilled to have you on to discuss what this means for the state of NATO and for European security in the long run. The new American administration clearly outlined their changing foreign policy and security priorities at the 2025 Munich Security Conference. Can you assess how said decisions have already started to affect relations with both allies and adversaries into the current day?
So Vice President J.D. Vance's speech in Munich was indeed quite a dramatic moment for everyone in the hall, but of course everyone else who followed it. But I think to fully grasp its significance, one needs to zoom out and actually read that speech in combination with a speech given by Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth the week before, and the readout from the US-Russia summit in Riyadh a few days later. So in the week before the Munich Security Conference, Secretary Hegseth in Brussels at a NATO meeting indicated that the US would over the medium term, significantly reduce its military footprint in Europe. And on top of that, he made a number of de facto concessions to Russia before negotiations on a ceasefire in Ukraine had even begun. A few days later, then came J.D. Vance's speech in Munich, in which he berated the Europeans for an alleged lack of free speech, out of control migration, and on the sidelines, he, among others, met with far-right figures in Germany just a week before the federal election. Now, shortly after the Munich Security Conference, you have the US delegation meeting the Russian delegation in Riyadh, and the readout of that meeting stated, among other things, that the US and Russia were looking forward to pursuing shared geopolitical interests. So, in other words, in the space of just a single week, the Trump administration questioned, or perhaps even called obsolete, not only fundamental strategic basis of the transatlantic relationship, namely that to ensure peace and security in Europe, Russia needs to be deterred, but the Trump administration also challenged the very normative foundation of the transatlantic relationship, that there is a shared liberal democratic value set that holds the alliance together. Now, if you then also consider that the US may also launch a trade war against Europe, and it, as you know, has already imposed tariffs on Canada, one really wonders what, if anything, of the transatlantic relationship remains. And of course, such as Azores had quite an effect in Europe. Even the most principled transatlanticists, those in Britain and Poland, or among sort of the German Christian Democrats, have had to acknowledge that we are in a completely new era, an era in which the Europeans can no longer rely on the US to defend Europe. And in response of the past days and weeks, we've seen quite frantic diplomatic efforts to reconsider, year-long, decade-long red lines on how to fund significantly higher defense spending that will be in order in Europe, and how to safeguard a potential ceasefire in Europe. So you could say that finally, Europeans are responding to this extremely loud wake-up call from Washington, and have at least committed to taking primary responsibility for defending the continent.
I'm interested if we can speak a bit further about how Europe can seize on the events of recent days to increase its support for Ukraine. We've talked about how quickly situations have escalated over the past few weeks and even the past few days since the White House's press conference with Volodymyr Zelensky last week. We've seen since then European NATO member states rally more closely around the Ukrainian cause. What do you think the ramifications of this incident and any subsequent conferences, and I believe it was the United Kingdom, will be for Europe and European security in the days and weeks to come?
Yeah, given the pace at which history is unfolding at the moment, I'm hesitant to make any predictions, but I think it is clear that Europeans have to at least prepare for the possibility that the US will hold almost all of its military assistance to Ukraine. Though, let me just emphasize this point. It is at the time of recording, this is unclear whether the US will hold the shipment of material, whether it will stop sharing of intelligence and so on. But either way, I think it's clear that Europeans will have to prepare for that scenario. And now, the Europeans, I think, know that they cannot make up for all of what the US currently provides to Ukraine, but there is definitely much more that the Europeans can currently, in the short term, do. The first thing they can do is to actually surge supplies of those equipment that the Europeans still have in stock. And that includes weapon systems that currently, for political reasons, have not yet been provided. Europeans can also provide greater funding to Ukraine to actually empower the Ukrainian defense industrial base, something that the Ukrainians have done quite successfully over the past months, is actually to, empower their own industry so that they become increasingly independent of Western supplies. And something else they can do is to actually try purchase from the United States those weapons that the US no longer wants to provide to Ukraine. So there are, a number of steps that Europeans can take in the very short term. I think over the medium term, and we are seeing this unfold already, in London the other day, Europeans were discussing whether to send troops to safeguard a potential ceasefire. So I think it's imperative that the Europeans actually come up with their own plan on how peace in Ukraine can be ensured. Because so far, Europeans have been fairly reactive to US initiatives. But in turn, I think an own plan, a credible plan underwritten by resources is the only way really that the Trump administration will take the Europeans seriously in any negotiation. Just to summarize, I think there are a number of material things they can do to provide military assistance, and the other thing would be to come up politically with a plan of what the Europeans wish to see in Ukraine, rather than just merely reacting.
As a result of these changes we've been discussing, can we anticipate any further changes in intercontinental defense and security relations as a result? And are there any notable voices or countries that the geopolitical center of this issue in Europe seems to be shifting towards?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think over the medium term, we will see a fundamental reordering of how European security is organized, because we are facing the very tangible scenarios that after 80 years of US security guarantees, we are entering a new era in which this can no longer be taken for granted, and this of course has vast consequences. So I think if we accept the premise that the US will withdraw significant military capabilities from Europe, something I think we have to accept, Europeans will naturally have to replace a significant chunk of that. And that is a steep task, because we're currently dramatically dependent on the US. And the task becomes even steeper if you also consider that the Europeans have to perhaps muster the forces to provide a backstop to Ukraine. But there isn't an alternative. There's no other way. So Europeans have to mobilize the resources, they have to dramatically increase defense spending, and they have to come up with what the German defense minister Pistorius at the Munich Security Conference called a roadmap to manage the, well, at least partial US withdrawal from Europe. So in that context, I would draw your listeners' attention to the upcoming NATO summit in The Hague at the end of June. Because that one will be the one to watch. It is there that a new defense spending pledge is supposed to be agreed upon. People talking about 3.5, 4%. And the said roadmap is meant to be discussed in The Hague. So it's shaping up to be a momentous summit. Now, on your question about the leading countries in Europe, I think given the gravity of the scale of reorganizing European defense, it has to be a number of countries that provide leadership in that matter. So it can no longer be as traditional European politics used to be organized between Paris and Berlin. It's absolute necessity that coalition is broadened to include Poland, to include Italy, but also to include non-EU members like the United Kingdom, which both on the diplomatic but also military side has assumed significant leadership ever since Russia's invasion in February 2022. So I think one mustn't underestimate the vast military but also political changes that the US change in grand strategy will entail in the years to come.
We're reaching the end of our questions for today, and we've been able to cover a lot of really fantastic ground. Before we conclude, I'd like to circle back to look at Ukraine specifically. How do you see the implications of recent events affecting the potential for a peace settlement in the Ukrainian war? And how specifically do you anticipate that the key players will proceed from here?
Yeah, I think the incidents and the rhetoric coming out of Washington have made it way more difficult to achieve not a ceasefire, but a durable ceasefire and peace agreement. And I think the Trump administration may be underestimating how resilient and how bullish the Ukrainians are. I don't think that the Ukrainians will want to accept a peace deal that the US and Russia impose on it, and one that lacks the proper security guarantees to ensure that Russia will not, after 2014 and 2022, launch a third invasion of Ukraine. So the overarching question then is what the security guarantees should look like to ensure that Ukrainians feel confident enough to sign such a peace deal. And if you accept that Ukraine is unlikely to join NATO anytime soon, I think we have to accept that. There are three options currently on the table. The first one is the one that is sort of highlighted by the Trump administration, that via the minerals agreement that Ukraine is supposed to sign with the United States, one creates a sort of incentive for the US to ensure peace and stability on the continent, in Ukraine, because it now has commercial interests in the stability of Ukraine. Now, I think most Ukrainian and other analysts are unpersuaded that such a vague and indirect security guarantee is sufficient. The second option, and I've alluded to it before, are peacekeeping troops from non-US NATO countries. The US has already clarified that it won't be providing troops on the ground and won't be providing Article 5 security guarantees to those troops that are on the ground. So such a force would consist of Europeans, including countries like Turkey and like the UK, but potentially also Canadian troops. This was at the heart of those discussions in London the other day. Now, needless to say, this would be politically extremely sensitive and militarily very challenging, because many European land forces are not in a great state. But it may be the only truly effective deterrent and assurance for Ukraine in the current scenario. So we'll have to see. I think here the news will unfold very quickly over the next days and weeks. Now, the third option, if such peacekeeping forces could not be provided, would be just increased and persistent military assistance provided to Ukraine, so that Ukraine cannot defend itself without, European troops on the ground. Now, this is politically less sensitive because it essentially entails intensifying what we're currently doing, but most doubt whether it would be terribly effective. So we'll have to see. There's so much in flux right now, but those are the options currently being discussed.
Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with our program today. We're grateful for your perspective on the very quick and rapid changes that are underway in European security affairs. And we know our listeners will benefit from your insights on how NATO and how the Transatlantic Alliance may evolve in the coming days, weeks, and months as we move towards a potentially unsteady or unstable peace in Ukraine. So we appreciate your time, and we look forward to hosting you again soon. That brings us to the end of the podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter, and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an update. For more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and events, be sure to visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. Thank you for listening, and a big thank you to our guests, Laura Thornton, Dr. Balkan Devlen, and Dr. Leonard Schütte. We'll hope you tune in next time. Take care.